Again, thanks for having me. The temperature is a little bit of a shock to the system, but I'm really excited to learn more about the EPSCoR initiatives, and in particularly the Alaska Adapting to Changing Environments program while I'm here. My talk was actually originally advertised as such: what is data visualization and how do you do it? There we go. I'll stand a little closer to it. But I'm hoping that you'll indulge a few modifications. Is that better? I can hear myself now. What is data visualization, and how, when, and why do we do it at Scientific American? PIPS gave you a little bit of a sense of my personal frame of reference of my bio, but I'd also like to talk just a few minutes about the publication that I work for, because it also has shaped my philosophy towards graphics and data visualization. Scientific American is the oldest continuously published magazine in the United States. It was founded in 1845 as a 4-page weekly devoted primarily to inventions. In the late 1850s, astronomy, chemistry, agriculture, applied science, and medical topics began to appear. In 1921, the scope officially broadened further. It shifted from an inventor's paper to a monthly periodical of popular science. The editors insisted that many of the articles be written by the people who actually did the work described, kicking off a tradition of scientist authors. The English language website was launched in 1996. This is how it appears now. And the most recent redesign was in 2010. Our tablet edition for the iPad was launched in 2012. And a Spanish language website, Scientific American Español, was launched in 2014. Our first international edition was launched in Italy, followed by 13 others, most recently Belgium and Holland. The international partners have access to our original content, but they also develop articles specifically for their own audiences, so it's not a page-for-page direct translation. As the editors in 1910 put it, it has been the constant aim of this journal to impress the fact that science is not inherently dull, heavy, or abstruse, but that it is essentially fascinating, understandable, and full of undeniable charm. So, what is data visualization? And how, when, and why do we do it at Scientific American? Let's start here. And yes, I'm starting with a cliche, the dictionary definition slide, but please stick with me on this. The Oxford Dictionary defines data as related items of chiefly numerical information, considered collectively, typically obtained by scientific work, and used for reference, analysis, or calculation. And visualization as the action or process of rendering visible, which suggests that data visualization is information, chiefly numerical, made visible. But that's a pretty broad definition, encompassing everything from bar charts to even dinosaur reconstructions, which are illustrations rooted in scientific measurements of things like bone length. But what if we shift our point of view a bit and think about data visualization in terms of content and context? Content is often pretty straightforward. It's the information that you're setting out to visualize, from time series to interconnections to category comparisons and beyond. The data set influences the form of the visualization. But I don't think that the larger visualization community talks directly about the idea of context enough. The intended audience and purpose should also be considered. Form follows function. Similar as with text, in which different writing styles are used for advertising, narrative nonfiction, PR, scientific journals, and newspapers. For example, John Snow's 1854 cholera map was a tool of investigation and analysis for the physician. By mapping out cholera cases, shown here with the black bars off the street in the center of the map, he was able to establish the source of the outbreak was likely a shared water public pump. The act of creating the map helped reveal the ultimate conclusions. Research papers often include charts that function as tools for analysis, but they can also include charts that communicate the author's findings to their peers. Design is rarely a top priority here, and there are a lot of assumptions regarding the intended audience's frame of reference. There's not really a sense that the author needs to make things inviting or easy for the reader, quite frankly. They've got a captive audience. People who need to know the research findings will read the paper. For graphics that communicate breaking news, production speed and clarity of message are of utmost importance. But for less timely topics, particularly in consumer magazines, more energy and time can be put into developing a seductive image. This graphic definitely aims to inform and inspire, but to compete with all of the media swirling around us, it also needs to engage the reader by providing compelling imagery and clearly and effortlessly walking the reader through the graphic. Annual reports and policy papers need to be clear and easy to digest. These graphics tend to cut to the chase, conveying data without extraneous details. But unlike research journals, there's generally more of an effort to guide readers through the graphics with things like headings and subheads. Some familiar forms have been co-opted by artists, such as the Feltron report, shown here. In the spirit of an annual report, Nicholas Felton meticulously collects data about his life and presents it in a visual form once a year. Each year, he ups the ante and experiments with different visual forms, themes, and data collection methods. Each report tells the story of his year. You could say that designers like Stephanie Posavec are pushing the envelope even further. She uses data as an organizational structure for works of art. This piece, for example, uses carefully documented themes in Jack Kerouac's book, On the Road. Each line represents a theme, organized by chapter, paragraph, sentence, and word grouping. Now, I think that this is an information graphic. It conveys information through a visual language. But the overall goal seems to be more one of gestalt and literary analysis, rather than explaining a highly specific concept. Now, this is a more fanciful example than some, but in advertising, the reader is rarely expected or able to actually read the graphic. The goal of the advertisement is often simply to impress the reader with the large and complex data sets that the company depicted can understand so that you don't have to. This extreme vertical format overwhelmed the internet for a few years, but I think its popularity might be fading a little bit. It's a lineup of statistics set up in an engaging and easy to digest format, but it relies almost entirely on words and decorative imagery to convey the information, rather than graphical representations of those numbers. And just like with text, there are good examples of all of these forms, and cringeworthy examples. But to my mind, execution of the form is secondary. It's also critical to select a form that best serves the context. For example, a scientist probably wouldn't publish their findings in the form of a haiku. Not to say that a haiku might not be an interesting and effective way of communicating their research findings, but it's not the best delivery form for initial publication, nor to communicate those findings in a useful way to the broader audience. Although it might be a clever and engaging hook to communicate those findings in, say, a tweet. Let's go back to this genre. It can be a clever and dynamic tool to engage an audience in order to communicate a series of statistics. But the visual devices in this form rarely advance the story. They certainly engage the reader, but the entire message would remain intact if you copied and pasted the text into a plain text document. As a visual journalist, my goal is not to provide a set of image-based cliff notes for the text manuscript, or what boils down to an illustrated pull quote. My goal is to push beyond the written word and deepen the reader's visceral understanding of a topic. Now, this form is perfectly valid in some contexts, and I've used it before myself, but the imagery is simply used to engage, not really to deepen understanding, and that's counter to my role as a journalist. Connie Malamed, the author of Visual Language for Designers, defined these as info posters, pages that are created to collect a variety of facts and figures about a topic in one place and to communicate it in an interesting and easy-to-read format. Whereas infographics and data visualizations help us see information in new ways. A viewer doesn't quite read an abstract infographic as much as study, analyze, and explore it. That's my goal when working with artists on developing data visualizations like this one for the pages of Scientific American. We aim to set up a particular narrative or a clear take-home message, but also allow the reader to explore the larger context. Before moving on, I should revisit this definition. At Scientific American, I art direct projects that fall along all points of this spectrum, from bar charts to dinosaur reconstructions. Some may think that I'm being a little overzealous when I refer to reconstructions as data visualizations. So rather than get hung up on semantics, it may be more useful to think of this as a Venn diagram of graphics types. Data visualization, or abstract representation, and figurative illustrations, including explanatory diagrams, all under the heading of graphics. Now that I've defined and recast the idea of data visualization, I'm hoping that you'll indulge another title morph for part 2. Why, when, and how do we create data visualizations and other graphics at Scientific American? Broadly speaking, there are 2 reasons for visualizing data: analysis and communication. At Scientific American, we're generally in the business of science communication. Specifically, we use graphics to engage, inform, and inspire a science-savvy but non-specialist audience. So when do we use them in the magazine? When images can tell the story more efficiently, effectively, or completely than words, like the iconic Feynman diagrams, in which a visual can stand in for a more abstract formula. When the narrative involves complex and intertwining relationships, and an image map can help the reader track connections, like a process diagram that explains the intricacies of photosynthesis. When the reader might benefit from seeing and exploring trends and patterns of the complete data set, rather than being served up a few key numbers in the text. When a direct and immediate visual comparison is useful in highlighting change or differences between states. such as competing hypotheses or before and after views. And once we determine that an information graphic might be a good item to include in an article, how do we go about conceptualizing and producing it? I'll start with some examples of figurative illustrations. For an article on greening disease in citrus trees, I started by reading the preliminary manuscript and outlining the basic needs of the graphic. The plan was to introduce the three main players: an insect vector, the disease-causing bacteria, and an orange tree, and then show how they interact. This article was written by a journalist author, so I did not have a scientist author to lean on from the start. I hoped to develop the plan a little bit further before calling in an expert consultant for feedback. So after reading the draft article, I did some independent research and soaked up as much as I could learn about the bacteria, the insects that spread it, and its impact on orange trees. Sometimes at this stage, I'll forward a very rough concept sketch like this and a research packet along to a freelance artist to flesh out. But often I'll take things a little bit further to make sure that the editor, author, and I are all on the same page with regards to the content before adding another link to the chain. In this case, I refined the sketch a bit. Starting with the introductory caption, the reader would then move down to the insect life cycle, and then over to the bacteria details, and down to the effects on the orange tree. The author pointed out that we could also incorporate a possible solution to the problem, a predator that could potentially wipe out the inductor insect. At this stage, you can see that I'm not too concerned with the details. I'm thinking broad strokes, main points, and flow of the story. That includes thinking out caption needs. How many notes are needed, and where? The next round is still pretty rough, but the details are closer to coming into focus. The previous round was more about making decisions on the overall structure of the box. This round is cleaner, so that I can more effectively communicate to the artist my hopes for the final art. If the concept is really abstract or very complicated, I will often send something like this to our expert consultant for a reality check. But this was a little bit more kind of intuitive, so I thought it was safe to bring in an artist first to tighten up the sketch before the first outside review. I sent freelance illustrator Sherry Sinnen my concept sketch and a research packet, and this is the type sketch that she returned. Our expert consultant did a very thorough review and returned a marked up PDF. I added some additional visual references based on those notes and passed along the notes to the artist. Here's the final art box. Once I get artists and expert consultants involved, I usually aim for a 3-step process like this: concept sketch, type sketch, final art. Often there can be some feedback loops that focus on specific details within the illustration, but the overall structure should really lock in as soon as possible. We simply don't have the time or resources to let things meander too much. And I found that really thinking through things completely at the start of the project saves a lot of time and energy later on. Now, many articles in Scientific American are written by the scientists themselves, so we have a direct line to a content expert. That was the case for this article on gamma ray flashes. The scientist author, Joseph Dwyer, passed along several reference images along with his text manuscript, including these 2 simulations. But we wanted to illustrate something that he apparently hadn't drawn out before: a side-by-side comparison of the 2 leading ideas on what causes gamma ray flashes in thunderclouds. We asked him directly for any reference material and a clear description of the 2 mechanisms. The author blew me away by not simply returning a few scientific papers and PowerPoint presentations. Instead, he sat down and carefully drew out the comparison. This doesn't happen very often, but it happens just enough to warrant very direct questions to the research scientists about specific illustration hopes. If they don't already have it, you might get lucky and receive a customized sketch. I was tempted to run the sketch as is, but I ended up hiring a painter to stylize things so that it would feel more at home in the pages of our magazine. Things start to get more and more involved when you begin to layer on multiple levels of detail and attempt to show both cause and effect. For an article about water on Mars, we had a clear and singular source, our scientist author Alfred McEwen. But we were hoping to illustrate something again that hadn't apparently been illustrated before. The leading ideas on why certain linear markings appeared and disappeared on the surface of Mars. The cause was likely water, but where was the water, and how was it being delivered to the surface in what appeared to be wet streaks? This article was published in 2013, before more confident Water on Mars proclamations were made from NASA last month. I started by blocking out a basic plan for the page. The streaks appeared seasonally during the extremely warm Martian summers. We'd address that in the top right orbit diagram, then move on to the various mechanism hypotheses below. Originally, I thought this might work best as a time sequence, the winter months represented in the blocks in the back, then moving forward in time to the front block when the surface streaks are visible in summer. Now, the author had described some of the details in the manuscript, but I was still a little bit confused as to how it all actually worked, and we were losing too much time waiting for further feedback. So I tracked down this related figure from another scientist's paper and asked the author if this was the sort of mechanism we should illustrate. And that prompted very fast feedback. And the text editor drew this out while chatting with a scientist on the phone. The author's clarification caused me to shift tactics a bit. Instead of showing a time sequence across the bottom, we'd show two blocks. One would include details on how the water might be originating from above the surface, and another would show various ideas on how it might be originating from below the surface. Here's a type sketch from freelance illustrator Chuck Carter. And the final version. Quite often, our graphics involve a combination of figurative illustrations and data visualization. We merged the two approaches to help convey change over time for an article on ecosystem collapse by journalist Carl Zimmer. One of the case studies Zimmer wrote about was well covered in the scientific literature. I tracked down a few key papers and developed a plan based on previously published figures. Here's the source material. One paper was qualitative, the predation patterns shown in the food web on the left, and the other was quantitative, change in critter abundance over time. I started by mocking up a layout with a straightforward before and after approach. But the network connections were almost impossible to track at this scale, and any small change in abundances would be really hard to compare between the panels. So I ended up superimposing the before and after views and supplemented the data with illustrations of the animals involved in the network by freelance illustrator Portia Sloan Rollins. Here, the black circle outlines represent the initial population size for each species. The color-filled circles represent the population 30 years later. The idea here being that you can simultaneously see the predation patterns between critters as well as the changes in their relative abundances. Like the Mars graphic, an art box in this article on sauropods would aim to pretty much sum up the entire article in one graphic. Sauropods, once thought of as an icon of extinction, were actually quite diverse, thrived for a really long time, thanks to a variety of traits and features that helped them to adapt to changing environments. The original concept sketches emerged directly from the original article summary. Okay, so they were diverse, lived for a long time, and had some cool adaptations. Let's show all three of those points with a gallery of species, a timeline, and a few concrete examples of those adaptations. I blocked out the full page, then hired paleo artist Raoul Martin to lend his expertise and copious research files on sauropod anatomy. This layout includes an early sketch from him. As Raoul got rolling on dinosaur reconstructions, I turned attention to the timeline, charting out extant periods for each species based on spreadsheets provided by the authors, and started to work up the adaptation details. Eventually, all three pieces came together in this final form. So how do we produce straight-up quantitative data visualizations for the magazine? In some ways, much in the same manner that we produce figurative illustrations. I began with a foundation of research, locate a few key sources, or in this case, a data set connected to the article content. Identify a content expert to act as an expert consultant, ideally the curator of the data set, if possible. And hire a freelance artist or data visualizer to develop the final image. Often, the reference material takes the form of a peer-reviewed journal article with a specific figure of interest highlighted, as well as the supporting data set from the scientist. In this case, the figure aims to establish that the more planets a host star has, the more stable and circular the planet orbits are. Why do we care? Well, planets with circular and stable orbits are more likely to harbor life. I sent freelancer Tiffany Ferrant Gonzalez the project information, and she returned several data sketches. The top two looked pretty cool, but they were kind of hard to read. The circular option was similarly aesthetically pleasing, but again, the data trends were hard to see. I gravitated towards the version in the bottom right corner, which was actually her first pick as well. This version echoes the original, but streamlines things a bit for our audience. Here's the final graphic. Orbital shapes are included on the left axis, and annotations, as it appeared in the magazine, are here as well. As the data set gets more complex, so does the collaboration process. You may recognize this figure, published in 2011 from Yang-Yul An and his colleagues. It connects food items that share chemical compounds. They then went on to cross-check these connections against recipe databases to see if there was a relationship between often paired ingredients to their chemical compound overlap. As it turns out, Western cuisine does tend to pair chemically related ingredients together, but classic recipes from East Asia do not. Our goal was to create an image that would bring some of the researchers' conclusions to a new audience, and perhaps reveal the patterns in an even more intuitive and engaging way. The paper was open. I could download initial data set to review, and it was a signal that the authors would likely be willing and excited about collaborating, which they were. Wai An and Sebastian Annert were really helpful in suggesting the filtering method and reviewing our sketches. With data in hand, I reached out to freelance data visualizer Jan Willem Tulp to see if he was interested in the project. Now, I've been speaking about most of these projects from the art director's point of view, not the artist's. If you'd like to hear about the artist's approach to this project, you can see a video of Tulp at the URL shown here. This is the first sketch that Tulp sent to me. It was definitely not his first attempt. The original Flavor Network already did a great job at highlighting the topology. He hoped to improve on it by sorting the groupings so that it would be easier to read the information. He sorted the ingredients into columns by category. Each black dot is an ingredient. The size of the dot corresponds to how often that ingredient appeared in the recipe database. The blue circle paired with each black dot represents the total number of links with other ingredients. Gray lines connect ingredients with shared chemical compounds within a category. Orange lines connect ingredients with shared chemical compounds across categories. The vertical position of the dot is based on the ingredient's mean shared compound value for all of the links that an ingredient has. This was the sticking point. In some ways, it's a logical metric to sort by. Ingredients with lots of strong relationships to other ingredients rise to the top. But it's kind of a complicated measure. It takes a few mental leaps. The overall structure and plan felt right, but the metric behind the vertical position of each dot was not intuitive. So we asked for variations. Tulp sent lots of options. I notated his screenshots with a description on the right to help solidify the logic in my own mind and to more efficiently communicate with other people on the article team. I won't get into all of the details about each sketch, but I thought you might like seeing some of the options that followed. This option was our favorite. Vertical position is based upon the total number of connections to other ingredients, not the strength of those links. The blue outlined circles that originally held that information were no longer needed. Once the structure settled in, we turned to fine-tuning the aesthetics, informed by the color palette and style that was emerging for the full special issue on food. Here's the final article. You'll note that we added annotations to bring attention to a few key points that we found interesting. But perhaps most critically, we included a large how to read this graphic panel, in which we walk the reader through the symbols used in the graphic in a really conversational way. This approach emerged pretty organically from the verbal explanation I had to provide whenever I showed the graphic to a colleague for the first time. And it was more inviting than a small key or a legend kind of crammed in the corner. Now, regardless of the scope of the graphic, I generally get started on every project with the same basic approach. At the magazine, the context is a given, so I move on to the content and get up to speed on the subject matter. After becoming familiar with the content, the editor and I talk and define what exactly the graphic aims to explain, starting with the wide view. Are we comparing and contrasting competing hypotheses, showing change over time, providing a nuanced and updated look at a familiar concept? Then I organize the content into a visual form that is informed by that overarching goal. For example, does a step-by-step approach make sense? Or is the concept cyclical? Are we showing how something works? If so, the physicality of the subject might inform the layout. Are we displaying evidence in the form of data? What chart type makes the most sense? Several people have developed tools like this one. This is by Andrew Abella, that acts as a guide that kind of helps lead you to a suitable form. Once I've spent some time thinking through the basic form, I develop the rough layout. These sorts of illustrations do not exist in a vacuum. They exist on a page with titles, captions, and labels. I find that thinking through all of those pieces from the very start really helps to streamline the whole process and force clarity of intention. I'll even draft straightforward and descriptive headlines and subheads so that I can better communicate my intentions to the editor and the illustrator. If the organization of the graphic is solid, then the illustrative details can develop organically within that framework. I try to get the bones organized properly before fleshing things out. I'd like to leave you with one final example that speaks directly to what is perhaps the most important variable of all, context. For an article on gene expression in the brain, we started with a few heat maps provided to us by the scientist authors, like this one. Now this is a pretty intimidating image for the uninitiated. But the original intent for this particular figure is to communicate results within a peer group. The audience is highly motivated to read and understand the image. And chances are, it builds upon an already familiar shared visual vocabulary within that group. I like to think of it as using visual jargon. Now, jargon can be incredibly useful. Words and symbols that carry highly specific information within a specific context can be a really efficient way to communicate to others that are fluent in that language. But it simultaneously acts as a brick wall to outsiders. There are few, if any, points of entry here for the uninitiated. Scientific American, on the other hand, is not required reading. So when developing graphics for the magazine, my goal is to knock down barriers of entry and to make the scientific content accessible to a wider audience. Sometimes that content is complicated, like this, and that's okay. The goal isn't to dumb things down or to oversimplify. The goal is to clarify. To that end, in this case, we didn't reinvent the visualization. Instead, we stripped away the barriers and added a few welcoming gestures. Here's the final product as it appeared in Scientific American by data designer Jan Willem Tolp. We didn't dumb down the material. Brain structure, terms remain intact. The full data set remains intact. We simply removed insider conventions, such as the rainbow color palette, replacing it with a more intuitive and aesthetically pleasing tonal scale. Included a few brain illustrations to act as locator maps and a signal to the basic content of the material. Highlighted a few structures in green, such as the cerebellum, and explained how to read the graphic in plain language. The title of this multi-day workshop, Data to Decisions, suggests that you're already thinking about context quite a lot. I'd like to encourage you not to lose sight of context when building the visualizations themselves. What and how are important questions. But don't forget to also ask for whom and why, and allow those answers to inform the shape and details of your final visualizations. Thanks for having me.